Well, thank you very much for such a wonderful welcome here to Toronto. I think we figured out it's been 2003 was the last time I was in this city, but it's been really wonderful, and I'm so honored to be here and to have so many people interested in coming and hearing. I always say that sort of I do what I do because I love reading these things and I want other people to read them. And so my work is really just sort of trying to make texts accessible and interesting to other people so they will read them with me. And sort of going back to the conversation I was having with Professor Newman before we started, that I think of myself as being very introverted, and I think of the academy as being something that takes introverts and makes them perform for a living. So anyway, so this is my text for today. The real text I want to talk about with you, and this is sort of a work in progress, so I hope you'll understand sort of that there may be questions I don't have the answers to, and I'm hoping that you will find avenues of entry into this material that reflect your own interests. But these works, these piyutim, these liturgical poems, I picked one text for us to look at, and it's the text it's the trial of the accused adulteress from the book of Numbers. Because the poems I work on are largely for the week's Torah portion. So every week there's the appointed Torah portion, and the poet in antiquity would have to sit and find a way of translating this poem into something that the congregation would appreciate and enjoy and respond to. And he had to weave in the interpretations of the biblical text with the prayer of the Amidah, the major prayer of the Shabbat morning service. So he has these sort of various poetic constraints that you'll see, the lectionary, so he has the Torah and the Haftarah that he's having to account for, and then also the prayers themselves. So this is from a period of time, as we'll see, it's around the middle of the 6th century of the Common Era, when the actual prayers in the Siddur, in the prayer book, were still fluid. The framework was there, but every week the text of the prayers changed in this dynamic response to the Torah portion. And so in some weeks, it's very easy, like when when the Torah portion is Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, he has a wonderful poem on monotheism and a nice polemic against Christianity, about the nature of sort of God's oneness and God's undivided nature. When it's the Tower of Babel, he waxes incredibly beautifully on sort of like the playfulness of language, because the Tower of Babel being all about language. But I wanted to sort of think about how he responds to a more challenging text. And so I thought that certainly for when I've taught the Introduction to Hebrew Bible, the ordeal of the accused adulteress is not a text that is sort of necessarily easy to imagine someone sort of figure how do you sort of approach that in the context of the Shabbat morning liturgy. So this is just an illuminated, the picture there, but it's a nice little poem. Tzurat ha'isha tishuka umitchazeket al doda mitrapeket. So the woman's passion grows stronger and she canoodles with her beloved. So that's a nice little, that's an illustration of a woman seducing her beloved, seducing another man. So to get you sort of into this poem, I want to walk you through, because like everything old is new again. So we're starting with the oldest text, which is the biblical text here. And so the trial, the ordeal of the sotah, the accused adulteress. There's going to be a lot of text on these pages. I want you, number one, anyone who emails me, I'll happily send you a copy of the PowerPoint or a copy of the entire text, because it's longer than I can read for you. The Torah portion that they read in the synagogues in late antiquity, they read it on the old, what's called a triennial cycle. So they read a much shorter Torah portion, because it took 3 or 3.5 years to go through the Torah. The shorter portion allowed time for these kinds of poems. They were very popular in their day. So, but I'm not going to try to read for you the whole Torah portion, but I want you to sort of, I want to refresh your memories of, or give you sort of like a sense of the context. So we have here that, so the Eternal One spoke to Moses saying, so this is Numbers chapter 5, verse 11. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, if any man's wife has strayed and betrayed him, in that another man lay with her and had intercourse with her unbeknownst to her husband, so she's been unfaithful, and she keeps secret the fact that she has defiled herself without being forced. So it's setting out very precise legal conditions here. and there's no witness against her. No one else knows about it. And then a fit of jealousy overcomes the husband, and he's jealous about the wife who has defiled herself. Or he's jealous even though she hasn't defiled herself. I mean, we have here a conundrum. The man is crazy jealous, and the woman saying nothing happened, and either nothing happened or something did happen and she's just not fessing up. So the man shall then bring his wife before the Kohen, the priest, and he shall provide as her offering 1/10 of a, so she had the flour offering, the oil, no oil because that's oil makes it too nice. No frankincense, because again, this is a very bare minimum kind of offering. It's the offering of jealousy, which calls to mind wrongdoing. And then she is brought forward to stand before God. And then the priest takes water in an earthen vessel. This is sort of this magical ritual kind of ordeal. And then he puts some dirt from the tabernacle floor into the water. And then he makes the woman stand in the divine presence, and then he bares her head. So as a married woman, her hair would be covered. So this is like bearing, I think we're all very sensitive to like the issues of hijab and things. So he bares her head, which is a kind of nakedness, and then she holds the offering. And then in the priest's hand is the waters of bitterness that JPS, it's intriguing, induces the spell, is how JPS translates this. Me marim ha'me'orarim, the bitter water of curses. So this is often sometimes referred to as the ordeal of the bitter waters. And then the priest adjures the woman, saying, if no man has lain with you, if you have not gone astray, then this ritual will have no harmful effects on you. But if you have gone astray while married, and you have defiled yourself with another man, and then here he has her drink this water with dirt mixed in it, may the Eternal make you a curse and an imprecation to your people, as the Eternal causes your thigh to sag and your belly to distend, which really seems to me you shall not be able to carry a pregnancy to term. And then in other cases, if she's innocent, then she will be able to carry a pregnancy to term, and the woman shall say Amen. So again, here we have this ritual. It continues. She drinks the spell-inducing water. She makes her ritual offering of the flour, and then once she has drunk the water, if she defiled herself, if she's guilty as charged, then her belly shall distend and her thigh sag, and she shall become a curse among her people. But if she has not defiled herself, then she shall be unharmed and able to retain seed. So this is the ritual of the jealous husband. So we have here this conundrum. The woman is, what do you do in this situation when there's no witness and the male gaze? Sort of like the male gaze is so dominant here. So there are various explanations for this that we can think of. It could be that it works. You have someone drink this water, and the curse has been dissolved in it as well as the dirt, and somehow it could be that it will be like the play will catch the conscience of the adulteress. That she will get so freaked out by this ritual that she will fess up if she's guilty. It could just be sort of psychological. It makes the husband sort of like nothing happens. Actually, the woman's kind of gross. Nothing happens, but it resolves the situation. Tikva from Erkensky, my teacher, said it was a way of averting domestic violence. It brought a woman in front of sort of a witness who then pronounced, whether it had happened or not, but it prevented sort of honor killings. It's certainly for the rabbis called to mind the punishment of Israel after the golden calf, where the calf was ground up and the Israelites were forced to drink it. And ultimately, it's an ordeal. It's a test in that it tries to get a firm answer to an unanswerable question. But I think you can imagine how this is a tricky one to imagine if you were the poet composing sort of a poem which had to sort of make this a part of the Amidah, the central prayer of the Torah of the Shabbat morning service. And this is the Torah reading. Where are you going to go with it? But before we get there, I want to take you into the Mishnah Sotah, which is a fascinating and somewhat disturbing text. But the Mishnah Sotah is entirely oriented on this ritual. So, and what's you'll notice here is the way that it is expanded into a spectacle. So now, no longer is she just being brought before before a priest, a Kohen. They, plural, they bring her to the high court in Jerusalem, and they admonish her the way one admonishes a witness in capital cases, as in Mishnah Sanhedrin, which is pretty intimidating. And they say to her, much happens because of wine, and much because of frivolity. Yes, college students always, much happens because of wine. Childishness, people, this is like good cop, bad cop kind of thing. So there's, they're trying to like make a comfortable space for her to just sort of fess up. Oh, I had too much to drink. It didn't mean to happen. And she says, if she says guilty as charged, then it becomes a matter for the law courts to settle the ketubah, because this is the Mishnah, so they're dealing with bridal contracts, and so you sort out the ketubah, and she just departs. It does, essentially, it causes a divorce. If she insists, I am innocent, I am pure, then they bring her up to the eastern gate by the entrance to the gate of Nicanor, where suspected adulteresses are made to drink, and where they purify women after childbirth. And then a priest grasps her garment. And notice, before in the Torah, it was they bear the head. Here, he grasps her garment, and if it tears, it tears. If it unravels, it unravels, until he has bared her bosom and he loosens her hair. Rabbi Yehuda, a minority voice, says, if her bosom is beautiful, he does not bear it. Now, the question, of course, is how does he know? If her hair is beautiful, he does not loosen it. Whoever wishes, let them come and watch. So I have here just, there's I know Daf Yomi is starting again. So there's a website where a woman has actually, her Daf Yomi practice was to draw Yomi. And this is her depiction of the woman being judged. And then also just an imagined idea of what the Sanhedrin looked like. But you can see here that what in some ways we could imagine in the Torah was a husband, the husband, the wife, and the priest is now a public spectacle, not just the hair is bared, but the whole, there's sort of significant voyeurism. And then we have here, this is Tosefta Sota, just as she stood before her lover, so too the priest makes her stand before everyone, Lifnei HaKol, in order to display her shame, as it is said, and the priest shall bring her near and set her before the Eternal. So in the Torah, before the Eternal is interpreted here as before everyone. And that's just a little drawing, hypothesizing sort of where she would have stood. And then again, just note how elaborate it is. I'm just sort of excerpting bits from the Mishnah on this about the detail they go into. If she was clothed in white, they clothe her in black. If she wore gold and jewels, they remove them so as to disgrace her. And after that, he takes a twisted rope and ties it above her breasts. And those who wish to see, again, this voyeuristic aspect, let them come and see, apart from her manservants and maidservants. She's given that little bit of dignity. And all the women are to see her. All the women, this becomes pedagogical. And all the women are warned not to act according to your lewdness. By the measure, midah keneged midah, measure for measure punishment. According to the measure in which a person sins, so is their punishment, so is justice measured out. And then again, it goes on with this sort of recap of how she will be punished. And then skipping ahead a couple chapters, she barely finishes drinking before her face becomes green and her eyes bulge, and she seems filled with veins, and the priests say, remove her, lest she defile the temple court. So she dissolves. So it's altogether more dramatic. So what does the Mishnah change? Because I want you to understand, this is because Yanai, the poet I'm going to be sharing with you, he is writing in the 6th century of the Common Era. So he knows the Mishnah very well, and he certainly knows sort of developing rabbinic traditions. But you'll see how he clearly knows the Mishnah when we get to his text. So the Mishnah transforms the ritual into a late antique spectacle. So it makes it public, it makes it kind of exciting, it kind of makes it, there's some human cost. It is gruesome and graphic, the way the woman is humiliated and then the way she dissolves. And the question is for those of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah, even in Mishnah Sotah, they declare the ritual suspended. It is something that, on the one hand, the rabbis find sort of fascinating to speculate about, and yet cannot imagine actually taking place, because it's so contrary, if we think about sort of rabbinic values of, sort of, we might say sort of modesty, dignity. So the rabbis, there, on the one hand, they find it, I think, sort of like the same way the rabbis, when they imagine like very sort of gladiatorial games and other sort of the way the world is out there. Again, if you think about the way the rabbis in Mishnah Sanhedrin discuss capital punishment, it's one of those things that sort of there's a wonderful book by Ishai Rosen-Tzvi called The Ritual That Never Was, which is about Mishnah Sotah. But it's sort of interesting to think that they spent so much time imagining it. But for Yanai, he would not have the opportunity to simply, this was not a scholastic exercise for him. He had to sort of work with these traditions in his synagogue context. So with that as background for how sort of these traditions, biblical and rabbinic traditions, find their way into the synagogue. And here, just for you, I have who was Yanai and what are piyutim. What is piyut? Yanai, I think of him as my guy. He was one of the first great Hebrew poets of late antiquity. He lived in the mid-6th century, we think, probably during the reign of the Emperor Justinian, for those of you who know sort of your early Christian history. So the Roman Empire was Christianized by this point. He's living in the Galilee. He's writing at the same time that the beautiful synagogues in the Galilee, that I'm sure many of you have seen pictures of, those synagogues are from the same time period. I always imagine Yanai in sort of that kind of synagogue, because he's clearly sort of the best poet of his generation. Now, Yanai, as I mentioned, wrote for this Palestinian Jewish triennial cycle. Now, and because he wrote for the weekly Torah portion, the problem was that by the 10th century or so, even sort of the most traditionalist Eretz Yisraeli congregations and diaspora congregations that follow the Eretz Yisraeli rite had switched to the Babylonian Torah cycle, which is what we still use today, where the entire Torah is read in a single year. So much longer Torah portions and read over a single year, which means essentially that everything Yanai had written became outdated. He no longer fit. It was like that he got everyone downloaded a software update and his program didn't run. Or his app didn't work, I suppose is how I should think of it now. So his works were consigned to the Cairo Geniza, because the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Old Cairo in the Jewish quarter had been a Palestinian Rite synagogue. And so they had used his poetry fairly late. But eventually even they adopted this annual Babylonian cycle. And so they chucked their old prayer books into the Geniza. And Yanai vanished. Now, he was not entirely gone, because Sadia Gaon, who was born in Egypt and then became the head of the academy at Sura, Sadia Gaon listed Yanai as one of the fathers of poetry, because Sadia Gaon really loved poetry, and he helped bring poetry from the West, from the land of Israel, to Babylonia, because the authorities in Babylonia had actually really been quite resistant to this dynamic, fluid, chaotic, changing liturgy that they had in the land of Israel. So we had Yanai's name on this list of among the fathers of poetry, but we didn't have anything by him that was known. Around then, Solomon Schechter, the whole story of the Geniza, which I don't have time to rehearse all of it here. So there's a picture of Solomon Schechter. That's how I always feel at the end of every semester. So organizing, doing making the joins that are the Geniza fragments. In the early 20th century, Israel Davidson, who was on the faculty at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, was looking at this Geniza material. And most people were interested in these, when they looked at these palimpsests, these texts that had been, the parchments that had been scraped and then written over, the sort of the recycling of the paper. Most people were fascinated by the undertext, because that's the older text. That's the text that was, that if we didn't have this parchment, we might have lost it. And that's how Solomon Schechter, for example, found the Hebrew of the Wisdom of Ben Sira. It was the undertext in a palimpsest. No one was paying any attention to the overtext, until Israel Davidson realized, looking at one of these texts, that he could make out a name acrostic. And the name acrostic was Yanai, Yud Nun Yud Yud. Because Yanai was the first poet in Jewish tradition to sign his works. And you'll see, I'll show you how he signed by means of an acrostic. Now we think of acrostics like in the Hebrew Bible, there are various Psalms and Proverbs and things where it's Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. You have sort of an alphabetical acrostic, and Yanai certainly uses those. But using the same technique that we know other poets, non-Jewish poets, were using in late antiquity, Yanai signed his name. He always signed it in the third unit of his composition, the Mishalesh. And so he suddenly went from not having Yanai's poetry to, with Israel Davidson, published fragments of about 22 poems in 1919. And then in 1939, Aaron Mirsky published Machzor Yanai, which was essentially almost the complete works of Yanai, at least a fragment for almost every Torah portion. In 1939, it was the last Hebrew book published in Nazi Berlin. And so that was, so really, it was sort of, we went from having none of his works, except for, actually, they later realized that probably Vayhi b'chetzi halayla, it came to pass at midnight in the Passover Haggadah, was actually a Yanai poem. And there's a big lively argument about whether Yanai actually wrote Unatana Tokef from the high holiday services, but that's unresolved. So we may have actually known some Yanai, we just didn't know it. But we went from thinking we had none of him to having almost his collected works, as it were. So that's sort of Yanai. And the Piyutim, he was the first to write for the weekly Torah service. The earlier poets wrote for high holidays, special occasions, Days of Atonement, that kind of thing. He wrote, by Yanai's time, it was every single week the people wanted a new poem. And I should mention that around 40% of the Cairo Geniza is considered to be poetry. So there was a lot of poetry. It wasn't sort of a marginal phenomenon. So now looking at our poem. So this is Yanai. We're missing the first two units of the poem. So, I can't know how it began. I have my theories. But starting with the third unit, and you can see, I put in red letters there on the margin. You can see Yud Nun Yud Yud, Y-N-Y-Y. So that's Yanai, spelled in the nice Palestinian Jewish way. In the Babylonian Talmud, it'd be Yud Nun Aleph Yud. So sharing his Eretz Israeli bona fides. You know, O our Creator, our evil inclination, that it is our afflictor, crouched always at our side. The adulterer is named lacking of heart, the adulteress wily-hearted. But you, O our Creator of the heart, probe deeply the heart's intentions. O Yah, extinguish the coals that burn within us, renew the heart of flesh and remove the heart of stone. Bind the evil inclination, and no longer shall you have to watch over young women who play the harlot, nor brides who may prove false. And so that's the poem. And then the verse from Hosea that's quoted is the first verse of the Haftarah, which I should note that based on Yanai's poetry, we've actually been able to reconstruct at least one version of the Eretz Israeli, the Palestinian Jewish Haftarah cycle, which was significantly different from what we have now because of the different Torah portions. So I would note that the verse from Hosea is what is used in the Mishnah when the ritual is suspended. So when the ritual is declared defunct, so that's the verse. So because God is saying, I will not punish your daughters when they commit harlotry, nor your daughters-in-law when they prove false. For they themselves consort with lewd women, and they sacrifice with harlots, and the people that is without understanding is distraught. But that first part of the verse, where God suspends the punishment, that is used to suspend the ritual of the sotah. So what I would note here is the fact, I would just sort of highlight at this point, the evil inclination, the way that there's sort of a distancing between human actions and the culpability. So this evil inclination, which was nowhere in anything we've read before, and actually the language resonates with Genesis 4, when God tells Cain that evil crouches in the doorway. So we have here that it's crouching, this demonic force is sort of granted responsibility. And eventually, the poet seems to be saying that God, this problem is something to do with the way creation itself was done. And it's begging God, so to bind the evil inclination. You gave us this evil yetzer. And again, if you can, there's a whole industry of footnoting Yanai and tracing all the sort of sources and the allusions that he has to biblical texts and to rabbinic texts. which I think certainly the more learned people in his congregation would have heard, but I also think that we have to imagine how it was heard by people with just more sort of basic knowledge. And so here we have this idea that, so God extinguished the coals that burn within us. It's again sort of the question of he's not simply saying, I hate women, which might be one possible way that he could have gone with this. Yanai generally is quite non-misogynistic. And also, and the idea that God, that sort of like you, our creator, created our evil inclination. So it puns there on Yotzreinu, our creator, and Yitzreinu, our inclination. So it's all rhyming poetry. And here the slide is a little bit off. So it has the woman who sinned through her hand. I have my text here. So it's the woman who sinned through, I don't know how to make it better. Apologies. Let's see. Okay. From the time when that woman sinned through her hand, you lashed and tied the hands of the woman. She is fire, and her name is fire, and she is likened to fire. Now this is clearly, who is this talking about? The woman who sinned through her hand? Eve. I got a nice little picture there. So, it's from a church in northern Syria, but I like the fact that she's like, it's got the hands there. So woman from man, she kindles embers in the bosom of man. She sinned and brought into being the bitterness of death. Her sin was bitter as death. And here you can hear echoes of Ben Sira, if you want, or sort of certainly wisdom literature. No one masters the day of his death, but all of her pathways lead down to death. In her eyes, death. Be'eneha mavet, beragleha mavet. Uveragleha miraked malech hamavet. So in her eyes, death. At her feet, death. At her feet will dance the angel of death, until you, O God, swallow up death and uproot the evil inclination, and remove the heart of stone from us, O Holy One. So we have here, again, this sort of this demonic kind of feminine, but the source, God is not, the poet turns again, the answer lies with the deity. So you, he's speaking to God, you will swallow up death. And again, that's an allusion to Isaiah. And it is you who will uproot the evil inclination. And this is actually language from magic bowls and amulets. This idea is sort of this, again, the evil inclination is understood as sort of a demonic force. And Yanai is using this to sort of claim that, like, and we'll see how he, to some extent, he doesn't totally exonerate the transgressors here, but he doesn't hold them as responsible as we might think. This is just a little sidebar. The angel of death dancing before women does occur in the Talmud Bavli. So do know that. So the angel of death is warning Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, so that he should not stand in front of women when they're returning from the presence of a dead person, because I go dancing, miraked, in front of them with my sword in my hand. So it's an intriguing little passage in the Bavli, but that's the only other place I found that idiom of the angel of death dancing before women. So we have there so we're moving on. So these poems are 9 poems long. That's part of why I'm sort of moving a little quickly, because I want to make sure I have time for you to give me questions. These are 9 poem compositions. These are not just like little Yehuda Halevi style lyrics. These are whole sort of Baroque cycles, and they always move in this fixed pattern. So the third unit always has the signature acrostic. The first 2 units, which are missing in this poem, embedded the first 2 blessings of the Amidah. And I think they probably referred a lot to Genesis 2 and 3 as their intertexts. But then we have the Assyria, which is a tenor. It always has 10 lines. It's an alphabetical acrostic from Aleph to Yud. So the woman with man in deception with deceit, unto the priest shall he hasten her, for her deception let him accuse her. And so this is rehearsing the entire sort of biblical ordeal. Into temptation and trespassness, sinfulness seduced her. So this is where I sort of say that the poet keeps returning to the idea that you made us this way. And the only sort of real cure for this conundrum is for you to sort of go into the system and change it. So sinfulness seduced her, A curse he proclaims upon her, an oath he makes her swear. So then we have sort of this whole sort of measure for measure form of justice, as we saw in the Mishnah as well. Just as, so too, just as, so too. Just as she betrayed the nature of her creator, he will make her drink curses from a created vessel. And then, echoing here the Mishnah, I just want you to sort of see how closely this resembles that dramatic scene from the Mishnah where the woman melted. The curves of her thighs will abruptly rot, and the depths of her belly will there empty out. Her lovely face will yellow and her eyes bulge. Her fingernails fall off and her sinews give way. They will see her and say, take her out, that alien woman, before she renders the temple court impure. So again, that's very similar to that to the Mishnah. That last bit about take her out seems to come directly from the Mishnah. But again, it's sort of this idea of the community sort of recoiling in horror. And I think you have these two exclamations, oh, how she was seduced, and take her out sort of bracket this unit. And I think one thing to imagine is that the congregation is being asked to sort of imagine as if they are sort of the witnesses to this scene. They're being called on to imagine that they're like the witnesses to this spectacle. So they're both, in a way, sort of witnesses and kind of a jury to what is being depicted here, which is not something they would have ever seen. Then we have, continuing, so we have, I've skipped, this poem 6 is very damaged, it's also very long. Some of these are very long, you probably think. Poem 6 is really long, it's a full alphabetical acrostic, full stanza for every letter. But it's also fairly damaged, and again, it's sort of a rehearsing of the biblical text. At poem 7, the rahit, this is a rahit, a runner. So these units have names. And this is where the poem pivots. And every week it pivots at the rahit, this runner, from sort of narrative, where it's sort of the poet's retelling for the congregation sort of his spin on the biblical Torah portion, to he pivots to sort of more active engagement. I think because maybe like you're feeling, the people are trying to get a little bit like heavy. And this is where it gets kind of perky and more participatory. So, and probably the phrase, she acted unfaithfully against him, probably constituted a refrain. So at this point, when I say participatory, it's not just participatory, people are really sort of actively getting involved. And again, this is that poetic justice. So she bound jewels upon her head, in shame she unbound the hairs of her head. She grew proud and fastened the braids of her hair. And there's a lot about hair in this poem, which I think is actually fairly significant to the rule for how like adulteresses in late antiquity were sort of their clothing and their hair was very significant to marking sort of like the scarlet letter. But the hair is significant. Also, demons have sort of crazy hair. So thus he judged she must hide her hair. This is why women normally have to cover their hair. So anyway, so she called, and the language here is very rich with the book of Proverbs, especially sort of Lady Wisdom and Dame Folly, as you see here. So the way the sort of false learning, and it's a whole question over whether we should. Some people may have sort of heard this poem almost allegorically, that it's not about women at all, but about sort of learning and false wisdom. So she defied both curse and adjuration, thus she succumbed to curse and adjuration. She set her eye upon another, thus she shall belong to neither her husband nor any other. So, and this is, that's Rossetti's Lilith. And then sort of heightening it, that's Rossetti's The Soul's Beauty, which is by the same model. To me it's significant, the same model posed for both Lilith and the Soul's Beauty. And in poem 7, this is the one place in the poem where Yanai contemplates, maybe she didn't do it. So what's interesting is that if she did not sin, let her be. Every single, the indented part is her reward, which has to do with fertility. So if she didn't sin, then she will be rewarded with fertility, sort of. But what's interesting to me is that even in the contemplating what she didn't do, it's a way of imagining what she could have done. So even here in the fact that she didn't transgress, it's not what she did do in a positive way, it's what she didn't do. So it's still, even though it's about what she refrained from doing, it's still a little bit on the lurid side. So she did not show herself outside the house. She did not play the harlot. She was not false against her marriage bed. So she did not drink stolen waters in secret, in allusion to Proverbs. So let her be crowned with good favor in public and in secret. So, and again, so this is his meditation. then he pivots from these. These are shorter lines. They're more active lines. They've got probably have these refrains where people are very participatory. At this point, the poet always, in poem 8, transitions to the Kiddush. Now, the Kiddush is the poem, is the part of the liturgy. It's Isaiah 6:3 and Ezekiel 3:12. Holy, holy, holy is the Eternal of hosts, the Sanctus, the Trisagion. It is the culmination of this entire poem, is the recitation of Isaiah and Ezekiel, so those verses from the liturgy. This entire genre of poem is called a Kiddushta because it culminates in this rapturous recitation of these verses, which I always think of them as Promethean words. They're words that the prophets heard up on high and brought down to the congregation, and humans can say them. And there's obviously, and throughout these works, there's a sense that sort of the humans are joining the angels in prayer at this very moment. It affects the body language of prayer to this day, sort of the physicality of how you stand and how you go on your toes. There's this idea sort of heaven and earth are coming together. And in a way, sort of, I think the story of the Sotah and the accusation and the way it's even amplified in the Mishnah, you can feel sort of so sordid by the end that you're sort of like, how do you go from that to the Kedusha? And so I think partly we have first this poem, the 7b, which contemplated the woman's innocence. And now here we have, I think, where the poet does some of his hardest work, even though this is rhymed prose. This is rhythmic prose. It's not even actually rhymed. For you, O God, dwell in secret, but everything before you is revealed and known. You give to a person their tasks and compensate them according to their deeds. The measure of affliction is diminished and the measure of good amplified. In evil doing you take no pleasure, but rather doing justly, lahatzdik, do you desire. And likewise, word missing, and giving thanks, bowing and bending knee, and prostrating and praising, your holy name hallowing. So you'll notice how in these few short lines, the poet has, number one, assured us that the woman may have thought, people may think they act in secret. He's not even specifying the woman. It's everything. Everything is known before you. And any person, man or woman, their tasks, that wickedness is punished, good is more than compensated. So I think what we see here is sort of the poet is anxious to both to vindicate divine justice, to say, that sort of like this ritual that you read, it may seem weird and it may seem off-putting. I mean, the rabbis, they declared it suspended. It seems sort of counter to our values, but it is not unjust. Or maybe that the suspension of it was considered sort of just. So, but the measure of good is amplified. And if you think, I hear resonance here actually even with like some of the high holiday prayers. And again, I mentioned Unatana Tokef, that prayer, charity, and tzedakah give, like tefillah, tzedakah, tshuva, yes, repentance. Okay, ameliorate the roa gezerah. So we have that sense that God does not desire the death of sinners, but their repentance, I think. So we have here that same kind of theology, and it's pivoting from that, not just to any sort of generic kinds of actions, but specifically to the body language of prayer, which again, this is in the synagogue, this is in the context of the Kiddusha and joining the angels in prayer. So that's a slightly late, that's a 12th century mosaic, I'm cheating. But it's got some really great seraphim there, so from Sicily. But this idea that the idea of bowing, bending knee, prostrating and praising, that is what God wants. Not just a negative what God doesn't want, but taking into the present moment, leaving this weird past, sort of in the past, and now turning to this liturgical present. And that came out too small for some reason, because I'm not very good at PowerPoint. So this is the culmination. This is the last unit of the poem, the Kedusha. So, and here we see, from among those who surround the throne, wings join to one another. So this idea, so now we've turned from the past to the contemplation of the heavenly hosts. And then we have Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So holy, holy, holy is the eternal of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. This quotation, which everyone, I'm sure, participated in. And then Yana actually goes through and takes each repetition of holy, in the same way that in Midrash, word repetitions are never just for emphasis. Word repetitions are significant. So each holy is parsed out. And what I find is the last one is the only one that's really intact, and that's holy from a place without women and men. I think here Yana is jealous of the angels, because in the angelic realm, because there are no men, there are no women, you don't have sort of this male insecurity that can drive a man crazy and lead to the accusation of a woman who may or may not have acted incorrectly. So when there's no men or women, that's one realm. That's God's. That's that holy realm, which is different from this realm. And then again, we have the repetition of the Kiddushah, and then again, holy from of old. And then he decreed 5 afflictions for women. This goes back to a rabbinic tradition again about Eve, and sort of their different enumerations of the afflictions that women bear. But also, from of old, God had compassion and took pity on the dignity of woman, which is an interesting sort of note of compassion here at the end. It's not clear what he means. One footnote suggests that this is an allusion to the fact that God put Adam to sleep when he created woman from the rib, because otherwise it would have been Adam would not have found her attractive if he'd seen like the rib, his side getting opened up and the rib taken out and this meat puppet made. So that's one understanding. But I think it's actually kind of interesting that Yanai doesn't tell us what he means exactly. He just says that God took pity on the dignity of women, because nothing in the poem before this was really so invested, it didn't seem like, in her dignity. And then finally, from a place, again, this text is very damaged, but from a place of modesty, he took the rib to make the woman. So again, going back to the idea of creation. So to me, it's really fascinating that throughout all of these poems, I feel like Genesis 1 through 3 are really the key texts that he's reading the sota, the accused adulteress, against, and essentially saying, just trying to sort of displace things from an individual woman's actions to the very fabric of sort of human nature. And so I think he's really sort of wrestling with that, but it culminates in the efficacy of prayer at the very end there, and then in the Kiddushah. So I'm going to offer you a few final thoughts, and then we can hopefully have a conversation. Am I doing fine on time? Okay. As a liturgical poet, Yanai displays tremendous mastery of vast amounts of learning. He deploys biblical phrases with delicacy and resonance, embedding them like the stones of mosaics in his composition, and drawing on their rich resonances with the vast body of rabbinic tradition that existed by the 6th century. But as a liturgical poet, he turned his learning and creativity to the realm of public performance, creating experiences shaped by popular entertainments and literary trends, even as he offered his community theological lessons of contemporary value. Thus, when the Torah portion placed the drama of the sotah at its center, Yanai needed to take a problematic biblical ritual and imagine it into relevance. The Kiddush's formal constraints, that's this genre of poetry, and its liturgical framing enabled Yanai to display his literary, exegetical, and theological skills, even as his aesthetic sense, artistic innovations, and understanding of the sotah ritual reveal how thoroughly a part of broader late antique culture he and his community were. Poetry in distinctive genres for particular settings, written in a range of languages by poets of diverse backgrounds, because indeed the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries are a period when we see this tremendous flowering of liturgical poetry, not just in Judaism and in the synagogue, but in Eastern Christianity, in Syriac, in Greek Christianity, especially in the works of Romanos, who was Yanai's contemporary, and in the Samaritan poets that I work in, as well as Latin poets and Greek poets of non-Christian or Jewish background. So there's tremendous flowering of poetry. It must be recognized as one of the most original and important modes of public intellectual discourse in late antiquity. We can today hold in our hands expansive traces, such as this text, of late antique religious experience bequeathed to later generations in written form. Harder to recover, but essential to consider, are the intangible, unrecorded aspects of these poems, the ways in which these works were experienced and engaged. Hymnody emerged in a context of contention and creative adaptation, as various communities, Jewish and Christian in particular, vied for authority, asserted superiority, and claimed authenticity. Hymns shaped public religiosity and fashioned communal identity. But for all their particular blossoms, liturgical poems shared roots in a common soil. And here I have some various images. So this is the famous Aphrodite, perhaps like the one that stood outside the bathhouse in Akko, modeled on a famous Greek harlot, prostitute, and then a bathhouse image of probably modeled on the statue, and then another image. So we could ask, could Christian arguments about original sin have colored Yanai's depiction of the Sotah, the way he calls on the imagery of Eve and the way that woman brings death into the world? Could the visual culture of late antique Christianity, its images of Mary and Eve, and it's interesting to consider the fact that in rabbinic tradition, Mary was considered a Sotah, as it were, someone who was not faithful to her husband, and that Jesus therefore was a mamzer. Could those images have informed some of Yanai's striking visuals or colored how he constructed femininity in a sacred space? Might Yanai or his listeners have been familiar with depictions of courtesans, like the Notice Phryne, and that's obviously a relatively contemporary painting of her trial being stripped bare, although it's the sight of her breasts actually save her. And she was probably the model, according to tradition, for that Aphrodite figure. Or the ubiquitous statues of Aphrodite, such as the one at the bathhouse in Akko. Would the priestly iconography of early synagogues have colored how Yanai's listeners envisioned the adulteress's trial before the priest? And would the zodiac mosaics affect how they imagined the heavenly hosts with whom they joined their voices in prayer? Similarly, how do material artifacts such as amulets and magic bowls inform Yanai's language, motifs, and imagery, along with the mystical traditions of the early rabbis, which so clearly color the heavenly speculations that fascinated our poet and his community and led to their fixation on the Kiddushah? We have Gaonic texts where the Gaonim placed limits on how often people could say the Kiddushah, the holy, 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 because people were so clearly entranced by these powerful angelic words. Even more, we must take seriously, as the Latin author Cicero did, the overlapping cultural spaces of theater, oratory, and law, because the synagogue was, as I hope you could tell from this very rapid summary, a place of performance. These are the spaces, visual, performative, and literary, in which Yanai and his community lived. I cannot tell you what Yanai had in mind as he wrote his poem on the Sotah, what he saw in the streets as he contemplated it, whether he enjoyed the entertainments of the popular culture or abstained, or how he got along with his wife, if he even had one. And yet these poems and the tremendous enthusiasm they generated reveal so much to us about Yanai's world, more than he could possibly know he was sharing. We can discern within such works what knowledge he took for granted and what touchstones he had in common with his community. At times, these contextual clues shimmer in my peripheral vision and slip away, but at other times they resonate with other writings and artifacts, amplifying what we understand on a multiplicity of subjects. Complex, fragmentary, evocative hymns may sometimes frustrate and confuse, but they can also surprise and delight. Yanai lived in a world both earthy and numinous. Every week he acknowledged the everyday, including the worst parts of the everyday. But he recognized that the quotidian could become transcendent. Heaven and earth touched all the time. On the Sabbath morning, the contact could almost be felt. Yanai's community joined their voices to the angels in prayer, and we hold in our hands the traces of that song. Thank you.